paper-lined cake tin. The kitchen would be warmer than usual, and my mother would have that "I've just baked a cake" glow. "Oh, put the gram on, will you, dear? Put some carols on," she would say, as she put the cake in the top oven of the Aga. Carols or not, it always sank in the middle. The embarrassing hollow, sometimes as deep as your fist, having to be filled in with marzipan. Forget scented candles and freshly brewed coffee. Every home should smell of baking Christmas cake. That and warm, freshly ironed tea towels hanging on the rail in front of the Aga. It was a pity we had Auntie Fanny living with us. Her incontinence could take the edge off the smell of a chicken curry, let alone a baking cake. No matter how many mince pies were being made, or pine logs burning in the grate, or how many orange and clove pomanders my mother had made, there was always the faintest whiff of Auntie Fanny. Warm, sweet fruit, a cake in the oven, wood smoke, warm ironing, hot retriever curled up by the Aga, mince pies, Mum's 4711. Every child's Christmas memory should smell like that. Mine did. It's a pity there was always a passing breeze of ammonia. Cake holds a family together. I really believed it did. My father was a different man when there was a cake in the house. Warm. The sort of man I wanted to hug rather than shy away from. If he had a plate of cake in his hand, I knew it would be all right to climb up onto his lap. There was something about the way my mother put a cake on the table that made me feel all was well. Safe, secure, unshakable. Even when she got to the point where she carried her Ventolin inhaler in her left hand all the time. Unshakable. Even when she and my father used to go for long walks, walking ahead of me and talking in hushed tones, and he would come back with tears in his eyes. When I was 8, my mother's annual attempt at icing the family Christmas cake was handed over to me. "I've had enough of this lark, dear. You're old enough now." She'd started to sit down a lot. I made only marginally less of a mess than she did, but at least I didn't cover the table, the floor, the dog with icing sugar. To be honest, it was a relief to get it out of her hands. I followed the Slater house style of snowy peaks brought up with the flat of a knife and a red ribbon. Even then I wasn't one to rock the boat. The idea behind the wave effect of her icing was simply to hide the fact that her attempt at covering the cake in marzipan resembled nothing more than an unmade bed. Folds and lumps, creases and tears, a few patches stuck on with a bit of apricot jam. I knew I could have probably flat-iced the cake to perfection, but to have done so would have hurt her feelings, so waves it was. There was also a chipped Father Christmas, complete with a jagged lump of last year's marzipan round his feet, and the dusty bristle tree with its snowy tips of icing. I drew the line at the fluffy yellow Easter chick. Baking a cake for your family to share, the stirring of cherries, currants, raisins, peel and brandy, brown sugar, butter, eggs and flour, for me the ultimate symbol of a mother's love for her husband and kids, was reduced to something that simply has to be done, like cleaning the loo or polishing the shoes. My mother knew nothing of putting glycerin in with the sugar to keep the icing soft, so her rock-hard cake was always the butt of jokes for the entire Christmas. My father once set about it with a hammer and chisel from the shed, so the sad, yellowing cake sat round until the end of February, the dog giving it the occasional lick as he passed, until it was thrown, much to everyone's relief, onto the lawn for the birds. Bread and butter pudding. My mother is buttering bread for England. The vigour with which she slathers soft, yellow fat onto thinly sliced white pap is as near as she gets to the pleasure that is cooking for someone you love. Right now she has the bread knife in her hand and nothing can stop her. She always buys unwrapped, unsliced bread, a pale sandwich loaf without much of a crust, and slices it by hand. My mother's way of slicing and buttering has both an ease and an awkwardness about it. She has softened the butter on the back of the Aga so that it forms a smooth wave as the butter knife is drawn across it. She spreads the butter onto the cut side of the loaf, then picks up the bread knife and takes off the buttered slice. She puts down the bread knife, picks up the butter knife and again butters the freshly cut side of the loaf. She carries on like this until she's used 3/4 of the loaf. The rest she will use in the morning for toast. The strange thing is that none of us really eats much bread and butter. It's like some ritual of good housekeeping that my mother has to go through, as if her grandmother's dying words had been, "Always make sure they have enough bread and butter on the table." No one ever sees what she does with the slices we don't eat. I mention all the leftover bread and butter to Mrs. Butler, a kind, gentle woman whose daughter is in my class at school, and whose garden has a pond with newts and goldfish, crowns of rhubarb and rows of potatoes, a house that smells of apple crumble. I visit her daughter Madeline at lunchtimes, and we often walk back to school together. Mrs. Butler lets me wait while Madeline finishes her lunch. Well, your mum could make bread and butter pudding, apple charlotte, eggy bread, or bread pudding, suggests Mrs. Butler, or she could turn them into toasted cheese sandwiches. I love bread and butter pudding. I love its layers of sweet, quivering custard, juicy raisins, and puffed golden crust. I love the way it sings quietly in the oven, the way it wobbles on the spoon. You can't smell a hug, you can't hear a cuddle, but if you could, I reckon it would smell and sound of warm bread and butter pudding. Sherry trifle. My father wore old, rust and chocolate check shirts and smelled of sweetbriar tobacco and potting compost. A warm and twinkly-eyed man, the sort who would let his son snuggle up with him in an armchair and fall asleep in the folds of his shirt. "You'll have to get off now. My leg's gone to sleep," he would grumble, and turf me off onto the rug. He would pull silly faces at every opportunity, especially when there was a camera or other children around. Sometimes they would make me giggle, but other times, like when he pulled his monkey face, they scared me so much I used to get butterflies in my stomach. His clothes were old and soft, which made me want to snuggle up to him even more. He hated wearing new. My father always wore old, heavy brogues, and would don a tie even in his greenhouse. He read the Telegraph and Reader's Digest, a crumpets and honey sort of man, with a tight little moustache. God, he had a temper, though. Sometimes he would go off crack like a gun, like when he once caught me going through my mother's handbag, looking for barley sugars, or when my mother made a batch of 12 fairy cakes and I ate 6 in one go. My father never went to church, but he said his prayers nightly kneeling by his bed, his head resting in his hands. He rarely cursed, apart from calling people silly buggers. I remember he had a series of crushes on singers. First it was Kathy Kirby, or they once said she was a bit ritzy, and then Petula Clark. Sometimes he would buy their records and play them on Sundays after I'd listened to my one and only record, a scratched 45 of Tommy Steele singing Little White Bull. The old man was inordinately fond of his collection of female vocals. You should have seen the tears the day Alma Cogan died. The greenhouse was my father's sanctuary. I was never sure whether it smelled of him or he smelled of it. In winter, before he went to bed, he would go out and light the old paraffin stove that kept his precious begonias and tomato plants alive. I remember the dark night the stove blew out and the frost got his begonias. He would spend hours down there. I once caught him in the greenhouse with his dick in his hand. He said he was just going for a pee. It's good for the plants. It was different, bigger than it looked in the bath, and he seemed to be having a bit of a struggle getting it back into his trousers. He had a bit of a thing about sherry trifle. That and his dreaded leftover turkey stew were the only 2 recipes he ever made. The turkey stew, a Boxing Day trauma for everyone concerned, varied from year to year, but the trifle had rules. He used ready-made Swiss rolls, the sort that come so tightly wrapped in cellophane you can never get them out without denting the sponge. They had to be filled with raspberry jam, never apricot, because you couldn't see the swirl of jam through the glass bowl the way you could with raspberry. There was much giggling over the sherry bottle. What is it about men and booze? They only cook twice a year, but it always involves a bottle of something. Next, a tin of peaches, with a little of their syrup. He was meticulous about soaking the sponge roll. First the sherry, then the syrup from the peaches tin, then the jelly. To purists, the idea of jelly and trifle is an anathema, but to my father it was essential. If my father's trifle was human, it would be a clown, one of those with striped pants and a red nose. He would make bright yellow custard, birds from a tin. This he smoothed over the jelly, taking an almost absurd amount of care not to let the custard run between the Swiss roll and the glass. A matter of honour, no doubt. Once it was cold, the custard was covered with whipped cream, glacé cherries, and whole blanched almonds. Never silver balls, which he thought common, or chocolate vermicelli, which he thought made it sickly. Just big, fat almonds. He never toasted them, even though it would have made them taste better. In later years, my stepmother was to suggest a sprinkling of multicoloured hundreds and thousands. She might as well have suggested changing his daily paper to the Mirror. The entire Christmas stood or fell according to the noise the trifle made.